The year is 2077. There was no nuclear apocalypse or alien invasion. The catastrophe stemmed from science run amok. 20 years prior, secret genetic experiments at a remote facility in the Nevada desert resulted in the reanimation of prehistoric species. Initially, they were controlled, but a catastrophic failure unleashed chaos. Among the creatures that adapted and thrived, none were as devastating as the Velociraptors. These aren't the slow lizards from the books, but fast, incredibly intelligent hunters, capable of coordinating attacks with terrifying precision. The United States, as we knew it, no longer exists. What's left of the population is divided into small, fortified communities or nomadic groups, constantly on the move to avoid the packs. The roads are potholed and treacherous, vehicles are rare, and life is a constant struggle for survival. Our nomadic group, approximately 20 straggling souls, has survived in the dusty Arizona wilderness for months. Led by Ethan, they're a mix of families, former civilians, and a few with combat skills. Their temporary refuge, an abandoned, fortified gas station, is running low on supplies. Water is scarce and food is rationed. Desperation hangs in the air. The group's only hope for survival is to reach the Green Valley, a persistent rumor of a fertile, mountain-protected region where raptors supposedly can't penetrate. But between them and the Green Valley lies the infamous Shadow Valley, a rocky, labyrinthine canyon that has become the hunting ground of one of the largest and most fearsome velociraptor packs. These beasts are led by a legendary alpha, known only as Blade, an exceptionally large and cunning creature whose snout scars attest to its ferocity and superior intelligence. The decision to cross the Shadow Valley was made after days of deliberation. There's no other known route. Hunger and thirst force Ethan's hand. They know it's a suicide mission, but it's their only chance. Dr. Aris, with his genetic maps of raptor behavior patterns, and Lana, with her ability to improvise repairs and traps, are the brains behind the plan. Ethan is the muscle who will execute it. The tense silence before departure is broken only by the howling wind and the hushed crying of little Kai. Everyone feels the weight of the Shadow Valley ahead. It's a crossing with no guarantee of return. The next morning brought a merciless sun, bathing the canyon in a yellowish light that seemed to intensify the menacing stillness. The nomadic group, in a tight formation, began their crossing of Shadow Valley. The terrain was arid, with jagged rocks and dry bushes that scratched at clothes and skin. The silence, occasionally broken by the crunch of boots or the rustle of wind through the stones, was heavy, almost palpable. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Ethan led the vanguard, his eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any movement out of place. His military experience manifested in every calculated step, every subtle hand signal to the group. Dr. Aris walked right behind him, the tablet in his hands trembling slightly as he consulted topographical maps and heat signatures. "The concentration here is unusually low for this area, Ethan," he murmured, his voice tense. "That could be good or very, very bad." Lana walked near the rear, her eyes attentive to the flanks and the well-being of the most vulnerable, including little Kai. The boy, in almost complete silence, clutched his plush dinosaur, his large, curious eyes absorbing the scenery, oblivious, or perhaps just resigned, to the imminent danger. The first indication of danger came not from a roar or a direct attack, but from a series of subtle sounds, a distant twig snap, a small rock slide from above. Ethan raised his hand, stopping the group. Everyone held their breath. The tension mounted when Lana pointed to a rocky outcrop ahead. "Movement on the ridge, Ethan." 2, no, 3 of them. They were Velociraptor scouts, lean and cunning. Their earthy toned scales camouflaged them perfectly in the rocky environment. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they observed. It was reconnaissance. Aris confirmed, his voice low. "They're scouts. They're assessing us, communicating our presence to the pack." Ethan's initial strategy was stealth. They tried to deter, using the rock formations for cover. But the raptor's intelligence was underestimated. The main pack, alerted, began to encircle them. Guttural roars echoed through the valley, not from just one, but from multiple points. indicating a coordinated siege. The sight of their silhouettes lurking among the rocks, their sharp claws visible in the sun, made many hearts pound. The group was forced to move faster, which exposed their vulnerability. A young woman, Clara, tripped, and before she could get up, a velociraptor leaped from a dry bush. Ethan, with quick reflexes, fired his shotgun, hitting the creature in the side. The raptor shrieked and recoiled, but the action cost a precious moment. "We need a barrier," Lana shouted, observing a narrow gorge ahead. "We can try to funnel them through there, but we need something to block the exit." She quickly identified a pile of unstable rocks at the top of an incline. "If we can bring that down." The decision was quick. Ethan and two other men broke off to try and dislodge the rocks, while Eris tried to guide the group through the narrow gorge. "They'll try to flank us," Eris warned, his academic knowledge translating into precise predictions. As Ethan struggled to bring down the rocks, the beasts advanced. Two raptors tried to scale the rock face, displaying astonishing agility. One of the older women in the group, Maria, who was protecting Kai, stumbled again. This time an ankle injury prevented her from continuing. The situation was desperate. Ethan managed to dislodge part of the rocks, creating a partial barrier, but not before a smaller group of raptors penetrated the rear, encircling Maria and Kai. "Run. I'll cover you," Maria shouted, wielding a trembling machete, determined to buy time for the others. Little Kai, horrified, was pulled by Lana, who, with surprising strength, dragged him into the crevice, feeling the heat of the predator's breath at her back. Maria's sacrifice was a painful turn, proof that the crossing would demand more than just courage. It would demand losses. Maria's loss hit the group like a brutal blow. The air was heavy with pain and fear, but there was no time for mourning. The crevice they had squeezed into offered temporary protection, but it was a dead end. The hope that the rocks would completely block the raptor's path vanished as screeches and scratches echoed from outside. The beasts were trying to climb the makeshift barrier. Ethan, his face hardened by loss and pressure, pulled little Kai close to him. The boy, who until then had remained in a state of silent shock, began to sob uncontrollably, his small body trembling. "She's gone, Uncle Ethan. Aunt Maria is gone." Dr. Eris, pale, turned the tablet in his hands to Ethan. "This makes no sense. Their hunting patterns, they shouldn't be this coordinated, this persistent, especially with a barrier like this. It's like they know exactly what we're trying to do." His glasses slid down his sweaty nose. No, it's impossible." It was then that the significant event occurred. A different roar, deeper and more imposing than any other, echoed from one of the rocky elevations above. And there, under the relentless sunlight, an imposing figure emerged. It wasn't an ordinary velociraptor. It was Blade, the legendary alpha. Its eyes, an intense yellow, seemed intelligent, almost calculating. Its jaw was marked by old scars, and one eye had a whitish cloud, giving it an even more sinister appearance. But what truly shocked the group wasn't its size or its scars. Blade was carrying something Eris recognized with a muffled cry of horror. It was a torn piece of a hand-drawn map, with notes about known routes in the Shadow Valley. They were his maps he had only shared with. The revelation came with Lana's cold voice. "It was him, wasn't it, Eris? The other paleontologist. The one who disappeared a few months ago, Dr. Elias Vance." Eris, shocked, could barely nod. "Yes, he and I shared data. I trusted him with every detail of my research on raptor behavior. I never imagined." "He didn't disappear, Eris," Ethan interrupted, his voice hoarse. "He was working with them." The implication was terrifying. Dr. Elias Vance, a brilliant and seemingly dedicated scientist, was not only alive, but was somehow collaborating with the Velociraptors. Or, more precisely, he was guiding them. Blade was displaying Eris's map as a trophy, proof of its intelligence and the betrayal that had sealed the group's fate. The turning point was clear. The threat was not just instinctive, but orchestrated. The raptors were more than predators. They had a human mentor. This transformed the escape into a calculated pursuit. Eris's affection for Elias had been exploited. Lana's trust in his data had been violated. And Ethan, who had always believed in honor, now faced the dirtiest of betrayals. Elias's betrayal had led to Maria's death and threatened everyone. Rage ignited in Ethan's eyes. With this shocking revelation, the dynamics of survival drastically changed. It was no longer just about fleeing predators, but about understanding the mind behind the hunt. The group was cornered, and the only way out was to outsmart or overcome not only the raptors, but also the man manipulating them. Lana, with a silent fury, began to rummage through her backpack. He wouldn't have just handed over maps. He would have provided information about our strategies, our resources, our weaknesses. She pulled out a small device, an old modified GPS tracker. This was for emergencies. But if he planted it somewhere, he might be tracking us. The new challenge was to find and disable any tracking device Elias might have left with them. Paranoia spread among the group. Who else knew? Who else could be involved? Ethan knew they would have to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than they had ever been. The cat and mouse game had become infinitely more complex and dangerous. Little Kai, despite his tears, looked at Ethan with a mixture of fear and childlike trust, making Ethan's burden even heavier. The revelation of Elias Vance's betrayal and Blade's disturbing intelligence forced the group into a brutal reevaluation of their strategy. Shadow Valley was no longer just a natural obstacle, but a carefully planned battlefield orchestrated by a human adversary and his coordinated predators. Distrust and fear now mingled with exhaustion. Ethan knew he needed to restore morale and confidence. He gathered the group, his eyes fixed on each of them. "Look at me." His voice was low but firm, cutting through the murmuring panic. "Elias Vance is a traitor, yes. He underestimated us. He thought we were easy prey. But he doesn't know us. He doesn't know what we're capable of when we're fighting for our lives, for our families." He gestured to Kai, who watched with wide eyes. "We're not giving up. We're not dying here." Lana, with cold determination in her eyes, began working feverishly. "Eris, do you remember any particular pattern Elias was obsessed with? Any signal, any frequency he mentioned?" Eris, still shaken by his former colleague's betrayal, forced himself to focus. He always talked about signal optimization. He wanted the trackers to be undetectable, but to emit a low-frequency pulse to guide the raptors, a kind of beacon. With this information, Lana began to search through each group member's belongings, using an improvised metal detector made from a broken radio. The tension was palpable. Anyone could be the unwitting carrier of the tracker. Finally, a faint beep came from the medical supplies backpack a kit Elias had generously donated weeks before their departure. Inside a secret compartment, Lana found a small device, barely larger than a coin. "Bingo," she murmured, her relief mixed with anger. This was guiding us straight into their trap. With a decisive move, she deactivated it, then broke it. The silence that followed seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Disabling the tracker was a small triumph, but Shadow Valley was still a deadly labyrinth. The group realized they needed to drastically change their approach. They could no longer just flee. They needed to adapt. Eris, the academic who avoided confrontation, began to transform. The guilt over Elias's betrayal propelled him. He stopped being merely a theoretical consultant and became an active strategist. "They expect us to run through the easiest path," he said, pointing to a seemingly impassable stretch of the map. "But what if we do the unexpected? There's a steeper path here, an old mountain hunter's trail. It's dangerous, but less likely Blade would expect a group of nomads to use it." Lana added, "We can set up some distractions. Sound traps. Elias trained them to be intelligent, but they're still predators. We can exploit their instincts." She began collecting scraps and branches, her mind already working on prototypes of noisy devices and strong scents to divert the raptors' attention. Ethan watched the changes in Eris and Lana with pride and a glimmer of hope. He had closed himself off after his war experiences, becoming a stoic, detached leader. But the presence of Kai, the little orphan who now saw him as a protector, and the group's resilience, were slowly melting his armor. He began to interact more, to listen, to comfort the weaker ones. He became not just a military leader, but a guardian. In a moment of vulnerability, while camping in a cramped cave, Kai approached Ethan. "My mom always said you were the strongest, Uncle Ethan, that you'd always protect us." The boy's words were both a balm and a burden. Ethan hugged him, silently promising he would do everything to fulfill that promise. He knew the next phase of the crossing would be the most dangerous, but now, with a renewed purpose, he was ready. Ethan's reflection was that he was no longer fighting just to survive, but to give these nomads a chance at a future he himself thought he had lost long ago. The difficult decision was to fully trust Eris and Lana, putting their lives in the hands of a scientist and an engineer instead of relying solely on brute force and military strategy. The new route suggested by Eris was brutal. The trail was almost vertical in some places, requiring the group to move in single file, climbing rocks and clinging to exposed roots. The sun still beat down, but the altitude brought colder, thinner air. The tension was almost unbearable. Every step was a gamble. Little Kai, exhausted, was carried on Ethan's back, who felt every muscle ache but didn't falter. As they ascended a narrow gorge, Lana quickly set up her distractions. Small improvised explosive charges with gunpowder and old batteries were placed at strategic points, programmed to detonate with a delay. The goal was to create an illusion of movement in false directions, forcing Blade to divide his pack or chase nothing. However, Blade's intelligence was underestimated. The Alpha's distinctive roar echoed, not from below, but from above, coming from a rocky ledge they thought was unreachable. Blade was there, observing, seemingly unaffected by Lana's distraction traps. Beside him, to the group's horror, was a human figure, Elias Vance. He was thinner, with a tanned face and strangely bright eyes, wearing rustic leather clothes and a kind of necklace made of raptor bones. He wielded an ornate staff, and his presence there was a testament to his deep and disturbing connection with the beasts. "You really thought you could trick me?" Elias shouted, his voice resonating through the gorge. "I know these trails. I mapped them with Blade. Nobody knows these animals like I do. I guide them to a future where we will coexist." His voice had a tone of fanaticism, of delusion. The scene was emotionally impactful. The betrayal gained a face and voice. Eris felt a knot in his throat seeing his former mentor transformed into a monster. Lana clenched her fists, rage boiling. Blade, responding to a subtle signal from Elias, advanced, followed by a dozen Velociraptors. They moved with terrifying speed, scaling the rocks with claws and teeth, closing the encirclement. Lana's traps detonated at distant points, but Blade ignored them completely, focused on the main group. Elias had taught the Alpha to differentiate real threats from false ones. Ethan knew it was now or never. Eris, Lana, take the group. I'll slow them down. No, Eris protested. We're staying. I created these monsters. I know how they think. And I know how to destroy them. Lana added, pulling out an improvised rifle she had assembled from spare parts. It was fragile but lethal. The scene culminated. Ethan moved forward, using a smoke grenade to momentarily blind the nearest raptors, while Eris, overcoming his fear, launched sedative darts he had prepared, targeting the weak points of the animals he knew so well. Lana fired her rifle, hitting the Velociraptor's eyes with lethal precision, while the other nomads, in an act of desperation and courage, threw rocks and whatever they could to distract the beasts. The confrontation with Blade was the crucial point. The Alpha, larger and faster than the others, leaped at Ethan. In a split second, Ethan wielded his machete, dodging the attack and sinking the blade into the raptor's hind leg. Blade shrieked in pain, but its ferocity increased. It tried to bite Ethan, who rolled, feeling the creature's foul breath. Elias screamed orders at Blade, his voice hysterical, as the Velociraptor tried to devour Ethan. In an act of desperation, Eris, who had taken cover, saw an opportunity. He fired a concentrated sedative dart towards Blade's blind eye, the most vulnerable point Elias had revealed in his own research. The dart hit its mark, and the Alpha let out a roar of agony. It was enough. Elias, seeing his partner stagger, lost control. The pack, without Blade's firm leadership, hesitated for a moment. Lana seized the distraction, aiming her rifle and firing a single, precise shot. The projectile hit Elias in the chest, silencing his screams and ending his betrayal. He fell from a ledge, tumbling over the rocks, and his figure disappeared into the abyss. With Elias dead and Blade staggering, confused and disoriented by the sedative, the Velociraptor pack panicked, scattering in different directions. The main confrontation was resolved, but the cost was high, and the silence that followed was filled with the gasping breaths of the survivors and the echo of the raptor's last screeches. Elias Vance's body lay somewhere in the abyss below, a somber note to the victory achieved. Blade, the great Alpha, had been sedated and wounded, scattering his pack, but the threat still hung in the air. The silence that followed the confrontation was almost as oppressive as the sounds of battle. The survivors, exhausted and wounded, but alive, slumped against the rocks, falling into a state of catatonic relief. Ethan staggered, little Kai still clinging to his back, and gently lowered him to the ground. The boy was pale and tired, but his now dry eyes expressed a new layer of understanding and gratitude. Ethan knelt, his shoulders heavy, feeling his accelerated pulse and the lingering adrenaline. He looked at the group, saw faces marked by dirt and fear, but also by determination. Eris, his hands still trembling, put away the remaining dart. He was a brilliant mind, but ambition corrupted him. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He wanted more than just to study. He wanted to control. He believed he was shaping a new era. He looked to where Elias had fallen, a mixture of sadness and revulsion in his eyes. The resolution of the main conflict brought with it the harsh reality of human nature and how power and knowledge can be distorted. Lana approached Ethan, quickly checking his superficial wounds. "That was close, Vance. But you did it. We did it." She gave a small smile, a glimpse of her pragmatic and resilient nature. Maria's sacrifice and Elias's betrayal had forged an unbreakable unity within the group. They had lost, but they had also grown. The group could now see the end of Shadow Valley. In the distance, under the setting sun, the mountains seemed greener, more inviting. It was the Green Valley, the promise of a sanctuary. The journey was still arduous, but the direct threat of Blade and Elias had been neutralized. As they prepared for the last stretch, Eris picked up a fragment of Elias's map that had been torn from Blade's mouth. He studied the notes, and his face twisted in surprise. Wait, Elias, he had a contingency plan. He mapped a series of underground tunnels, old mining shafts, that connect this valley to other evacuation points. He intended to use them for himself, in case Blade failed or turned against him. This revelation tied up a loose end. Elias wasn't just a traitor. He was a meticulous strategist, thinking of all scenarios. The existence of the tunnels meant there were other escape routes in the infested world, a hope that humanity could move more freely in the future, if they knew how. Despite the exhaustion, a new sense of purpose ignited in the group. They were no longer just fugitives. They were trailblazers of new knowledge. Elias's map, though a symbol of his betrayal, became a guide to a safer future. The group finally emerged from Shadow Valley, the fresh air of Green Valley filling their lungs. The trees were lush, and the sound of a running stream was music to their ears. The ending was emotionally satisfying not for the absence of pain, but for the overcoming and renewed hope. They had survived the impossible, and in the process, discovered the strength to rebuild not only their lives, but also hope for a future in a transformed world. 2 years have passed since the terrible crossing of Shadow Valley. The nomadic group, now expanded and revitalized, has settled in the Green Valley, transforming it into a prosperous and protected community. The mountains formed a natural barrier, and the main entrances had been fortified with ingenuity and newly acquired knowledge. Ethan Vance was no longer the silent, tortured leader. He had found a new purpose. With Lana Kincaid by his side, they oversaw the construction of advanced defenses and the organization of reconnaissance expeditions. Ethan still carried the scars of war and loss, but his eyes now gleamed with a quiet hope. He spent afternoons teaching self-defense to the youth, and little Kai, now 10 years old, was his most dedicated apprentice, exhibiting surprising agility and observation skills. Kai had overcome the trauma and had become a resilient boy, a living symbol of humanity's capacity to rise again. Dr. Eris Thorne had become the intellectual pillar of the community. With Elias's maps and his own notes, he unraveled the migration patterns of other dinosaur species, and more crucially, the routes of the underground tunnels Elias had mapped. He spent hours in his library, a tent filled with books and diagrams, working on an ambitious project, a communication and mapping system to connect isolated communities, using the knowledge of the tunnels as safe routes. His guilt over Elias's betrayal had transformed into a driving force for redemption, and he dedicated himself tirelessly to using his knowledge for good. The story of the crossing of the Velociraptor Valley became a whispered legend around campfires. It reinforced the core lessons of the journey: the importance of unity in the face of adversity, the danger of corrupted knowledge, and the unwavering resilience of the human spirit. Elias's betrayal served as a constant reminder that the greatest threat doesn't always come from beasts, but from the darkness in the human heart. The community in Green Valley didn't live without fear, but they lived with intelligence. They learned to coexist, to anticipate, and to divert, rather than just react. The tunnel system, a macabre legacy of Elias, was becoming the key to a safety net for other survivors. The story ends on a striking emotional note. At an orange sunset, Ethan, Lana, Eris, and Kai stood on the crest of one of the mountains, observing the valley they now called home. The stream murmured, and the wind rustled the leaves of the trees. The outside world was still wild and dangerous, but there in Green Valley, they had found more than a refuge. They had found a new chance. They had survived the impossible, and in the process, discovered the strength to rebuild not only their lives, but also hope for a future in a transformed world.